Dobry din, my friends. It has been a long time since I've published a video, and I have little motivation to do so regularly going forward. As you can tell by my voice, I'm also quite sick. However, I will be quite busy for the next couple months, and I've put way too much effort in researching this topic and creating these slides and writing articles to just let the whole thing die without a coherent end project. So, here we are, Rusyn Revivalism, a critical analysis. Now, many watching this video have likely heard about the Great Rusyn National Revival, or the resurrection of the Rusyn nation. In fact, if you are a participant in Rusyn culture today, you would have an almost impossible time avoiding the subject. But what exactly are its origins? What is the origin of its strategic philosophy, more specifically? Well, I find a passage in From Nowhere to Somewhere, a recently published autobiography by Paul Robert Margucci, to really capture the essence of the movement, and really its first choice. Now, of course, in 1989 to 1991, the early years, there were no institutions representing Rusyn interests. There were no politicians, and anything that could have been had been almost completely erased during the decades of silence. So the people who had essentially resurrected Rusynness and the Rusyn national consciousness had a fundamental dilemma. What are we to do now? As Maguchi writes, there's essentially two choices. The first is a political top-down approach, where you would work toward instituting language education, identity, cultural practices through primarily political activity. On the other hand, you had people like Natalia Dudash from the Vojvodinian Rusyn community in Serbia, who advocated instead for a strategy primarily focused on culture and education. This talk about what Dudash believed. Education, not political activity, was the only means to guarantee the future survival of carpatho-rusyns as a distinct people. Anyone who knows the revivalist movement and its leaders knows that the second option, aligning with Dudash, was the one chosen. Now, why was this? Well, there's a few things to keep in mind. Number one, the Rusyn revival cannot be separated from a certain post-Cold War liberal optimism. The idea that liberal or European values would continue to spread eastward, and these were the things to look up to. Western Europe and its values, and American culture were things to believe in now, to attempt to emulate. In this was a renewed belief in mass democracy, in the rule of law. This is very inherent. If you take nothing else from this presentation, understand that all of the choices the past 35-ish years have been made with this in mind. Now, this strategy was not taken by everyone in the Rusyn world, in particular Subcarpathia was more mixed, but this type of liberal optimist position, this following of Dudash, was done pretty much by the entirety of the diaspora, of the people that actually mattered in terms of making the decisions, and also Western Carpathian Rus. So think of Hungary, Slovakia, and Poland. Now, what was the result of this decision? Primarily focusing, foregoing building the political institutions, nationalism, political parties, to help ingrain Rusynism at a state level. Well, we can't exactly complain. In many of the countries that really embodied this position, the number of Rusyns grew with every census. In Slovakia, in Poland, in Hungary, and to a lesser extent, Romania even, I believe. From this system Of course, we have the Carpatho-Rusyn Society, Mlody Rusynim, the World Congress of Rusyns, all very deliberately constructed institutions on this model of culture and educational activity. Is this the real story? Is this all there is to know about the revivalist era? I don't think so. To understand the shortcomings of revivalism, we must understand why it succeeded in the first place, at least succeeded as much as it did. First, the underlying conclusions about Rusyn identity could be supported emotionally, even if not intellectually. What I mean by this is that there was a feeling, at least by the generation of that era, that Rusyn identity was a real thing and it was felt by thousands of people. When you have that and an open societal culture, or more so than it was during the communist era, you would have to screw up in many ways to not harness that in some way. The governments of Europe and larger EU structures also supported this development, as we can see through organizations in Slovakia, in Poland, in Hungary. These organizations were not outlawed. They are actually primarily subsistent on funds from the central government. Our culture runs through the national governments of Central Europe and larger EU structures. On a local level, certain politicians and parties could be against the rise or the resurrection of the Rusyn people, but you essentially have a stamp of legitimacy, and this is incredibly important. And also, too, we can't deny whatever faults and ideological errors that I'm going to talk about next. We see a high concentration of motivated and intelligent individuals in this early era, especially the 90s and 2000s, that often effectively made up for many of the flaws and problems that were characteristic of Rusyn revivalism. Now, what exactly has gone wrong? I think this quote by Simeon Pij does a good job in starting the question of a Rusyn nation. Now, even as Maguchi and others write, they talk about a third Rusyn national revival. But is that really so? Do we have all of the components that come with a nation, not just a people, but of a nation? This is where I think it becomes a problem to choose education and culture over political activity. Because while education and culture may help keep a people alive, political activity cements nationality. We even see today the question of boykos and hutzels. Are they Rusyns? At present, they're a type of periphery that we still have no distinct answer for. And because we have not been active politically, such distinctions have not needed to be made. We can get away with saying they're kind of Rusyns, they're kind of Ukrainians. It's up for people to decide. Perhaps I will create a longer video on this topic. Also integral to analyzing the revivalist movement is the end result regarding the nation today. For a people so geopolitically disadvantaged and depleted by decades of oppression, we certainly have gained a lot. But what if, in this process, we've also ignored many of the things we needed? Perhaps our body and soul as a people has, in some ways, atrophied. Imagine a scenario where a new class of young leaders do not develop because there are no positions to fill except in powerless organizations mired in incompetency. Imagine a society that is dependent on national governments and greater structures for almost the entirety of its cultural production. Imagine a society that is run by elders who believe that nationalism and youthful ambition are things in every case to be contained, not used for the greater good. These are not just theoretical statements or examples on my part, but an actual description of our most vibrant communities. If we look deeply, we will not see a growing nation today, but one that has been affected by each of these, and, at least in part, has resulted in its stagnation and decay. Did you know, for example, that the number of Rusyn speakers in Slovakia did not rise in 2021 compared to 2011, but actually declined, along with those who identified with Rusyn as their first nationality? How can we forget about the Lemko community in Poland that still resides primarily in the western regions and has had each and every one of its attempts for the national government to return the land to its rightful owners in Lemkowina be denied? Much is also said by diasporan and Western Carpathian Rusyn activists about the incompetency of Rusyn organizations and leaders in Subcarpathian Rus. Yet, their standard ideological line that Ukraine will eventually be inducted into the EU, and this is when they will be recognized as a distinct people, seems now more like a pipe dream. And furthermore, as I have said elsewhere, fundamentally ignores the underlying reality of Rusyn identity in Ukraine and how Rusynism and Ukrainianism are incompatible. What better way to disprove revivalist ideology than to state the simple fact that after the Euromaidan, a supposedly Europeanizing movement, the situation with Rusyns in Ukraine is even worse than it was before. Worst of all, though, the previous rules no longer apply. We have no real political institutions of our own. No army, no political parties, no autonomy, not even a universal, unified language standard. Now, as the world moves toward a more chaotic direction, I think we should realize how wrong some of this philosophy was. If not because of the end result of the many of the things I've previously talked about, then in this. The myth of an ever-globalizing and liberal world was an illusion, and we banked our continued existence on the exact opposite. Regardless of what worked in the past, it is very unlikely that the same actions and strategy will work in the future. As for what I advocate for, well, that will have to wait for another video.